Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Icon Minds in partnership with Arper. Today we're going to be talking about the future of transport. I'm joined by Dale Harrow of the Royal College of Art, who's chair of the Intelligent Mobility Design Programme. Thank you so much for joining us, Dale.
Not at all. Great to be here.
In terms of considering the future of transport, I just wondered, in say 25 years, when I look out of the window and I currently see kind of cars and other vehicles going by on the road, what do you think that I'll see in the future?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've got a friend of mine that looks out, he's been working at the college for a long time, and looks out the studio and he says not much has changed in the last 25 years. The mixture of cars and things looks much the same, but I think that's been the past 25 years, and we're probably in the period of the biggest amount of radical change we're going to see in the next 25 years. Certainly with autonomous vehicles coming on board, and in intelligent transport in the broadest sense, and access to mobility services through apps and other devices.
You mentioned automation. To what degree do you think automation is the kind of solution to all our ills? For example, the intense congestion that we see in transport systems in cities?
I think it's autonomous vehicles is going to be a really major thing, not just in terms of people, but in terms of goods delivery. So that's going to change really the way that the city works. We could get to a point where there's no goods vehicles, for example, during the day, but only operate at night. And of course, the other thing with autonomous vehicles is the opportunity to really reduce the amount of road deaths through through driver error and through things like speeding or drug driving. So there's a really major opportunity to improve the world through autonomous vehicles. It will have drawbacks. It's like any new technology. When it starts, there'll be problems, particularly as it mixes with existing traffic. But I think cities and government and policy will actually have to move quite quickly to ensure it happens.
I know there are a lot of skeptics when it comes to automated vehicles. For example, some say they won't actually resolve the congestion in cities because ultimately we'll still need one car per person. Do you subscribe to that sort of view, or are you quite optimistic about how much they can change things?
Well, I'm an optimistic person. I think you need to be a designer, and I think the interesting thing is I think we're not talking just about autonomous cars, cars as we know them now. We're talking about autonomous vehicles which inevitably will be shared vehicles or other vehicles that are taking goods as well as people, and I think that's really going to be the biggest change. So instead of a big bus lumbering down the street, we might see a series of vehicles that are platooned or of a footprint that is quite a normal size. If you imagine a conventional family car that maybe takes 4 people and some luggage, but most of the time has 1 person in, that footprint could easily accommodate 14 or 15 people as a small bus. So in terms of traffic footprint, we can see a totally different way of doing things. What's
been your thinking behind the London cab, which I know you designed, and there's also a kind of climate-friendly version, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, been working on a replacement for the existing cab, and I worked on the previous one 20 years ago. And I think at the time that was really about extending a brand and making it more inclusive, which we did, which was very successful. But the new one is really about making it much more sustainable. And if you think about London as a place, there's a lot of cabs, there's a lot of delivery vehicles sitting in traffic with big diesel engines running, creating a lot of pollution. So if we can reduce just a segment of the market, it makes a big difference on total air pollution. And that's really a big challenge. Air pollution now is really killing people silently. And also, of course, we're seeing things where it's affecting school children. Schools are talking about making areas safe or putting kids in a bubble. So there's a lot of issues about air pollution which are really coming to the fore. There's been some work saying it can maybe be used to Alzheimer's disease and things like this. So there's a lot of things coming through at the moment. So it's a really big challenge. And of course, these challenges are global. It's not just in London. It's in every city in the world. So we're facing the same challenges, which is really interesting. But it's also very good for galvanising people to think about these things.
I mean, in your work at the RCA, I know that students are kind of coming up with really innovative designs for vehicles and infrastructure. Could you tell us a bit about what's at the very cutting edge of kind of vehicle design at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think vehicle design has been traditionally divided into public and private transport. So a lot of designers have wanted to work in the private space, designing vehicles for brands, and branding design has been a big thing in car design, certainly for the last 20 years, in terms of, you know, what is a Jaguar, what is an Audi, how do you define that, how do you represent that physically, you know? So that's been a big challenge, but that's really beginning to change as the companies have to be more disruptive to understand these changes that are happening. We're having to disrupt the design process. So that's encouraging different sorts of students that we haven't seen before. We've got science people, technology people, more women joining the programs than ever before. And that's really great in terms of increasing diversity, but also increasing the type of people that are coming on the course in terms of what they want to achieve. And a lot of people now are not just necessarily wanting to go into industry, they're wanting to go into areas where they can really make a difference. You know, so we're seeing students from Asia, for example, wanting to go back to Asia to improve the climate by designing vehicles that are better. So that's a change, I think.
So in a kind of period of, I guess, huge flux within transport and infrastructure, what are the key aspects of transport and infrastructure that need to change?
Well, I think the really big challenges at the moment, we see things in silos. So we see vehicles being designed and then introduced into a system, and the real challenge is to break those barriers down between them, and we need people that can understand those different areas and are able to pull those people together. So I think now if you're designing a transport system, you need architects, you need town planners, you need policymakers, you need designers, you need social scientists, and you need to put them together and bring them together to create that system. You can't just, in the old days, it used to do this thing called over the fence. You design something, you throw it over the fence, and they'd work on it, and you throw it over the fence again. And you can't have these hard barriers anymore. The actual really innovation occurs between those silos, where you've got people talking to each other. So we're not only creating people that can design, but people that can actually work in those multidisciplinary environments, which is very difficult. You know, I've worked on some very difficult projects. We did a redesign of a London ambulance, and that was very challenging because we were working with medical people, ergonomists, commissioners, and you get these groups that are very, very static, you know, in terms of how they do things. So trying to introduce a more global response to that, I call it organic design, where you need everyone to be participating. So you have to have methods to bring people to do that.
How do you think technology can help empower us as users, and how can it be better harnessed, I suppose, by the transport sector? Well,
I think, yeah, I mean, transport is so broad, isn't it? I mean, at one end of the scale, we've got people walking. So how do you improve people's health? The last mile, there's a lot of discussion going about the last mile at the moment and the integrated journey.
So what is the last mile?
Well, it's the idea that the problem with people not using public transport is that you're not at your final destination. So your journey starts when you get on the bus, which might be a mile away from where you live. And the real thing is the journey experience from when you want to use it. So that might be in your house when you're buying it on an app. So the journey experience is a really important part of it. The whole journey experience, not just the sitting on the vehicle and being transported. So there's a lot of discussion about the last mile. How do you get that last mile so people can get from the bus stop, if you like, to the house, and you've got shopping or you've got children. You know, often when we're talking about things, we talk about a kind of imagine a person that's perfectly fit, can cycle, can walk. But if you're a mother with children, or
with shopping bags,
or you've had an illness or something, or a bit infirm, that last mile is crucial. You know, so people stay using their cars because of that last mile. So how do we make it better? And technology can do that in a sense by either providing a service that gets you that last mile, either through shared car ownership or whatever it is, or shared vehicle ownership, or by improving your navigation. So when you get up at the bus stop, it tells you which route you should go on. And you feel it's safe. So those are some of the issues that are coming out, you know.
So there could be more initiatives around shared car use.
Yeah, and shared ownership is interesting, isn't it? Because cars are sold on this idea of particularly a kind of man in a cockpit with passengers, you know. But as soon as you get away from that, it's no longer a car; it's a living space, and it's you know a shared living space that moves. It's a completely different environment, so people can work. It might not be this big reclined position. It might be a more formal position. We've done some work looking at looking at bigger vehicles that could move within a segment, which might be mobile cafes, for example, mobile gyms that are constantly moving around, but people can get on them and move back. I mean, at one end of the scale, you could have a moving park bench, that you sit on, have lunch, and it takes you to your next destination. I mean, it doesn't always have to be fast moving. It can be the pleasure of movement.
But nowadays, aren't we all in a hurry to get somewhere? Is the purpose of transport simply the arrival?
Well, I think it's a challenge. I mean, if you project what's going forward, and I've been doing some work on this, you could say that we've got a period of movement at the moment with apps and things, but why do you need to move at all? You could just be virtual movement. You could sit in your bedroom and you could, or your living room, and you could go to work. You could interact virtually with people. You could go on holiday. So, is the purpose of movement in the end? Is it not really there in the future? Do we get to a point where we don't move at all? We just have virtual experiences, and I think that would be really sad.
Yeah, because the implications for community cohesion, for health, would be really detrimental.
No, absolutely, and the thing. One of the things you just mentioned, the thing about community. There's a great community delivered by mobility. Areas that don't have mobility, the community falls apart, and you can see that. We're always focused on the city, but you move outside the city to rural areas, and you've got mobility poverty, where people don't have movement because the bus service has gone. They don't go to the shops, they don't communicate, they can't go to the doctor. It's difficult to get a doctor's appointment, but then you find you can't get there for 3 weeks because you've lost. So it's a really crucial thing. Mobility is a really important thing.
That's interesting, because I guess we perceive transport as simply a mode of transit from A to B, but actually in a scenario like that, a rural setting, the ability to access services, etc., that has a huge impact on your quality of life.
Absolutely, yeah. And in terms of friendships, even if it's just going to the pub or going shopping and bumping into someone, you lose those interactions and it falls apart completely. Now, you could say that these new technologies could enable it, car share and things like that, could enable to build communities, and I hope it will. I think it's very important. Those areas have been neglected for ages. In a sense, there's been far too much concentration on the city, not enough thinking about the more global aspects of rural communities, all the bit in between, the suburban areas. I live outside London. I can't afford to live in London. I live outside, so all I can do is use a train or use a car. And that's what most people are like, really.
I mean, what would the other alternatives be in an ideal world?
Well, I use a motorbike, which I love driving a motorbike. But I mean, it's in a way, the alternative would be a car share, probably. But I don't know people in my local area.
And also, it's a question of flexibility.
Absolutely,
correct?
yeah. And security, you want to feel the journey is secure, People use their cars because it's their own space. It's an extension of their living space. They can listen to music, they can smoke, they can do what they want, really, in their own space. And that's what you give up in shared space. So there's an interesting design, there's lots of interesting design issues there between what's been traditionally hard public transport and private transport. And the new area in the middle is civic transport. What does that mean? So it doesn't mean that a bus it has to be hard seats. It could be a very comfortable bus, or there might be areas within a vehicle that could be like a coffee bar or something. Think of first class air travel, and it's designed to be gender balanced and everything. It's a completely different experience.
How can we better design spaces of transport to create places of cohesion, community cohesion, and what you call kind of civic space, I suppose?
Well, I think any design has to come from who you're designing for. So you need to understand people, and that's very important. It's very subtle as well, because there's a lot of cultural issues underneath use. So it's not just the simple get from A to B. There's things that crop up in terms of how people use transport. I mean, in certain areas of the world, sharing vehicles is very common, and it's not. There's no ranking in that. It's not sort of first class transport or second class. So you have to encourage that. But you can do that through design. If you're on an aircraft, you can sit next to someone for 12 hours, and there's a way of partitioning it off so you're not. You can be private in that space, which is very intimate. I mean, I often think when I'm doing long haul travel, this is really weird. I'm sitting next to someone for 12 hours and they're sleeping and they're eating. It's like a marriage, you know, and you don't even speak to them most of the time, because if you open the conversation in the first hour, you're stuck with it for 12 hours. So what do you do in those circumstances, you know? But there are ways to get around those things, I think.
The last area that I really wanted to ask you about was, you know, an area of kind of where technology and transport intersects, which is drones. I mean, I guess we now have the technology to for drones to be useful forms of delivery and so on. I was wondering how realistic a tool they will be in terms of transport, and how far in the future this will be a reality, this drone world that we've kind of been talking about.
I think drones are very interesting because, you know, there is a lot of things going on with drones. So at one end of the scale, again, I'm sorry, I'm talking one end of the scale, it's one of my ways of doing things, but at one end of the scale, we're seeing drones being announced that can do real difficult things like build whole buildings, which is really interesting when you think you could have a drone building a building above us at the moment as we're speaking now. So that's quite interesting. So drones doing kind of mechanical work is one thing, but I think we don't want a sci-fi world with these things buzzing around our ears. So I think there's a lot of work, again, culturally to be done about this. And obviously the natural thing is to have drones built around rivers and areas where they can be used safely. But it's a difficult, I mean, we did some work on a driverless car, and there was a interesting, technology was really adaptive, but it came down to really, people's views are either dystopia or utopia. You know, the dystopian view was, it was going to be desperate, you know, people would have our information, they'd know where we were all the time, drones would be buzzing around, blah, blah, blah. The utopian view would, all this technology would work together, you know, there'd be automatic street sweepers, things would be delivered to your door, it'd be beautiful, you know, and you'd have leisure time and everything because all this stuff was being done. So there's somewhere in the middle, really, which is the reality of those things. And somewhere in the middle is where most people's perceptions would end up, you know. And
how far in the future is this world in which, you know, our Amazon deliveries come by drone? I think it's there. If we want, you know, it's there. I mean, some of the great things are maybe in areas where it's very difficult, like in Africa. Drones are starting to be used for medical deliveries and blood deliveries, which is just tremendous. That's incredible. In those areas where, you know, people can't get to medical services. And haven't they been used in disaster zones and exactly, that kind of scenario? So I think that is amazing. I don't know whether it's another kind of, you know, that third axis is the natural one to grow to, because the other two are full, you know, but it's not I don't think it's necessarily a pleasant scenario. I certainly wouldn't like the buzzing sound of drones going on 24 hours a day. So there needs to be some thought put into it. And I'm not sure, again, legislation-wise, whether we're going to get to a point of, you know, whether people consider it to be safe for these things to be flying about. So the technology will be there, but it's all the other stuff that we need to unpack and understand, you know. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dale. No. I think you've given us a really good insight into the fact that transport isn't just a utilitarian design medium, but it kind of intersects with so many other areas of our lives. And indeed our culture in a sense. So thank you so much for that insight. No, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about it. I think it's a really exciting time and equally dangerous time. We've got to move steadily and think about these issues as they come up. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this 4th episode of Icon Minds in partnership with Arper. There will be another episode coming soon, so please do join us again. Thank you.